Welcome everyone. Today we'll be talking about volcanoes. Here with me is Dr. Smith. Welcome and thank you for agreeing to do this interview. So Dr. Smith, what exactly is a volcano and what would you compare it to?
Thank you for having me here today. Basically, a volcano is an opening on the surface of a planet from which magma or magmatic gases emerge. I would compare volcanoes to cats. With a few exceptions, they spend most of their lives asleep.
What is magma exactly?
Magma is molten rock containing dissolved gases and crystals, and it originates in the mantle. When a volcano erupts, magma emerges in one or more forms: continuous lava flows, fragments varying in size from boulders to ash, or rapidly flowing currents of hot gas and rock fragments. The erupting lava and gases build up around the opening or the vent to form the volcano.
What causes the shape and type of a volcano?
On Earth, the type and shape of a volcano is largely dependent on its tectonic setting, which is basically where it's located relative to the tectonic plates of the Earth.
Where can you find volcanoes?
Active volcanoes are found on every one of Earth's continents, even Antarctica. About 600 continental volcanoes are considered active, but there are many more volcanoes under the sea.
What determines whether a volcano is active?
Volcanoes are considered active if they've erupted within the past 10,000 years.
Are there more volcanoes on land or underwater?
There are many more underwater. In fact, most of the volcanoes on Earth are underwater.
What determines where volcanoes will form?
The location of volcanoes is controlled by plate tectonics, as I stated earlier. With rare exceptions, the Earth's volcanoes sprout at plate boundaries, which are where plate tectonics meet or pull apart. Over 94% of historic eruptions have occurred along plate boundaries. It's not a coincidence that most earthquakes occur along the same boundaries, where the Earth's plates are spreading apart or being pushed together.
Could you tell us more about the plates?
Yeah, sure. The Earth's crust is made up of plates that fit together like a giant jigsaw puzzle. Beneath the plates lies the mantle, which covers the plate's hot interior. Heat from the deep interior causes a very slow circulation in the solid mantle, which flows very slowly like in a glacier. Rocks that flow upwards within the mantle eventually reach a level where the temperature is high enough and the pressure is low enough for some rocks to melt. The molten rock, in turn, rises upwards because it's less dense than the surrounding rock around it. This molten rock, which is called magma, rises through zones of weaknesses in the crust.
What are zones of weaknesses?
The zones of weaknesses are the plate tectonic boundaries, which are like the gaps made between the plates themselves. Hence, magma often reaches the surface along mid-oceanic ridges and subduction zones. There are, however, some exceptions.
What are the exceptions?
Volcanoes can also emerge in the middle of plates. These are known as intracontinental volcanism or hotspot volcanism.
Before we talk about that, could you tell us more about mid-oceanic ridges?
Yeah, I can. Most of the volcanoes along the mid-Atlantic ridge are underwater, but they poke through the ocean's surface to construct islands here and there.
How are volcanoes along the mid-Atlantic ridge created?
Volcanoes along this ridge, such as Iceland, are created because two tectonic plates are spreading apart. This allows magma to erupt and create new crust.
What happens when eruptions occur in the same place over a long period of time?
Eruptions that occur at the same place over long periods of time build mountains from the bottom of the sea, and then eventually they'll create a new island.
Moving on, could you tell us more about subduction zones?
If the Earth's plates are spreading apart in mid-oceanic ridges, they must be either destroyed or pushed back down elsewhere around the Earth. This happens at the subduction zones, where oceanic crust, which is denser than continental crust, is pushed beneath the continental crust and, together with sediments and water, carried down a steep slope into the mantle. Subduction zones are where oceanic and continental plates are pushed against one another, rather than pulled apart. When two oceanic plates collide, and one plate subducts back into the mantle, an island arc is created.
Could you tell us more about hotspots?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier, some volcanoes exist away from plate boundaries. A particularly good example is Hawaii, which is a state here in the United States. which is an island chain created by volcanic eruptions in the middle of the Pacific plate.
You mentioned intercontinental volcanism earlier. Could you further elaborate on that exactly?
Yeah, sure. Intercontinental volcanism is the most complex type because it's something of a mixed bag of information. The eruptions occur away from plate margins and can be the result of either a hotspot or rifting of the crust. The magma comes up through continental rather than oceanic crust to erupt at the surface.
So why do volcanoes erupt?
The basic principle of how volcanoes erupt are the same wherever they're found. Since magma is less dense than solid rock, it can rise from the mantle along plate boundaries and other zones of weaknesses in the crust. Most volcanoes have a magma chamber beneath them. Magma may stay in that chamber for years until the pressure in the magma chamber builds. This buildup is generated by an influx of new magma into the chamber, which causes the rock to fracture and magma to be released. The fracturing triggers earthquakes, which often signal that an eruption is about to happen.
Why do some volcanoes erupt with a big bang while others do not?
The key factor is the gas dissolved inside the magma, which include pretty much water, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide, and there are a few other ones kind of thrown in and mixed together, but there's very small percentages. As the magma rises towards the surface, the temperature and pressure decrease, which makes it possible for the gases to escape. Imagine what happens when you take off the tab on a can of fizzy drink, or for more fun, a bottle of champagne. The way gases come out of the magma determines the explosivity of an eruption. If the magma contains gases and is very fluid, then the gases will bubble out and form fire fountains, which is kind of fun. On the other hand, if the magma is gas-rich and syrupy, then the gases cannot escape easily and will eventually explode out. This explosion rips the magma to shreds and creates great clouds of gas and ash. If the magma is viscous but very low in dissolved gases, then it will ooze out slowly like toothpaste being squeezed from a tube. A volcano can have different types of eruptions, and the intensity of the explosion can vary even during an eruption. Gases tend to migrate toward the top of the magma chamber, so many eruptions start out explosively and become progressively more effusive as the gas is depleted.
Does anything else determine how explosive an eruption will be?
Yeah, there is. There are a few things that you should know. A magma's composition is also critical in determining the explosivity of a volcano because the composition largely determines the magma's viscosity. Location is important because the tectonic setting largely controls the composition of the magma. The rheology of a magma, or the way in which it flows, depends on several factors including chemical composition, temperature, the amount of dissolved gases, and the proportion of solid materials such as crystals.
How are volcanic rocks classified?
The classification of volcanic rocks is based on their silica content and their alkali content. The main magma types are basalts, andesites, dacites, and rhyolites.
What makes up a magma's chemical composition?
The key factor in a magma's chemical composition is the amount of silica in the magma, which is also found as silicon dioxide. The magmas that contain the least amount of silicon dioxide are the least viscous.
Does the amount of silicon dioxide affect anything else besides a magma's chemical composition?
Yeah, it also affects the viscosity of the magma.
How?
Well, the silicon dioxide content affects the viscosity of the magma because silicon and oxygen atoms form strong bonds in interlinked tetrahedral groups. This is called polymerization. The higher the percentage of silicon dioxide in the magma, the more polymerized it can be. Other factors such as presence of other minerals or gases can either encourage polymerization or can break down the bonds between the silicon and oxygen atoms. For example, water in the magma can drastically decrease viscosity, while carbon dioxide can increase it. The amount of solid crystals also has a significant effect. The more solid crystals in the magma, the more viscous it will be.
You mentioned earlier that temperature also affects a magma's rheology. Could you elaborate on that?
Yes, the hotter the magma is, the more easily it will flow, obviously like water. Two types of magma at the same temperature will not, however, have the same viscosity. The more silicic magma will always be more viscous.
You also mentioned the amount of dissolved gases also affects a magma's rheology. Could you elaborate on that as well?
The gas content of the different types of magma can also vary. Generally, the more gas in the magma, the bigger the explosion. Thus, the more silicic magmas are likely to be the more explosive ones.
Could you tell us about the different types of eruptions?
Yes. The classification of different types of volcanic eruptions began with Italian scientist Giuseppe Mercalli. He started the tradition of naming different types of volcanic eruptions after the places where they are most common. In order from least explosive to most explosive, they're Hawaiian, Strombolian, Vulcanian, Palaean, Plinian, and Ultraplinian. The last two honor Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman writer who gave us the first scientific written description of a volcanic eruption, which was that of Vesuvius in 79 CE.
How are modern-day volcanologists classifying the size of eruptions? Is it any different?
Well, more recently, volcanologists have developed a relative measure for classifying the size of eruptions, the Volcanic Explosivity Index, or the VEI. The VEI runs from 0 to 8. The VEI also of an eruption it's not necessarily a precise number, but it is derived from observers' descriptions, the volume and type of material erupted, and the height of the eruption column above the volcano.
Could you tell us about the shapes of volcanoes?
Volcanoes do not always produce mountains or cones, which is a common misconception amongst people studying volcanoes. Effusive eruptions, such as Hawaiian and Icelandic types, produce long lava flows that often come out of many fissures rather than a single vent or source. If lava flows from Hawaiian or Icelandic type eruptions keep piling on top of one another, then they will eventually produce a shield volcano, which is named for their shape like a warrior shield. Shield volcanoes frequently have large craters, called calderas, in their center, which are formed after large quantities of magma erupt from the magma chamber. The eruption then leaves the chamber's roof without support, and thus causes it to collapse.
What happens if the magma is viscous but contains little gas?
In this case, the lava is extruded rather than exploded, and forms what is called a lava dome. Domes are generally monogenetic, which means formed by a single eruption. Once the eruption is over, the volcano will not erupt again. Unsurprisingly, monogenetic volcanoes are smaller than polygenetic volcanoes, such as shield volcanoes, which are formed by repeated eruptions over long periods of time.
Are there any other shapes of volcanoes can form?
Yeah, there are. Mildly explosive eruptions, such as Strombolian, form a small, steep-sided cinder cone around the vent. The cone is constructed from the fragments of lava that land around the vent.
What kinds of shapes do Vulcanian, Palaean, and Plinian eruptions form?
More explosive eruptions, such as Vulcanian, Palaean, and Plinian, produce large quantities of pyroclastics. They produce cones like Strombolian types, but they can also have lava flows. This causes the classically shaped volcanoes such as Mount Fuji in Japan. Such volcanoes, formed by the combination of layers of lava and pyroclastics, are called stratovolcanoes. The beautiful, unswept shape of Mount Fuji and many other stratovolcanoes is caused by the evolution of volcano activity as the volcano grows older. When these volcanoes are young, their eruptions tend to come from a single central conduit. When they're old, fractures can open on the lower flanks, allowing lava flows to emerge. Not all stratovolcanoes have Fuji's symmetry, but when a volcano has a very large Plinian or ultraplinian eruption, the top of the volcano can collapse into the caldera, cutting off the top of the volcano.
Okay, final question. Does anything else influence the shape of a volcano?
The number and shapes of vents also has a significant influence on a volcano's shape. Vents can be either like pipes or fissures. Pipes originate from deep inside the volcano and are connected directly to the surface. Fissures or cracks are found cutting down the flanks.
Well, thank you again for helping us with this interview.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me today.
You're welcome.